Sure. So welcome everyone. I know that a few more people may be joining. It takes sometimes a little while, but welcome to this series of webinars that the Climate Justice and Just Transition Donor Collaborative have set in motion. And the reason for these webinars was to try and get a learning space for philanthropy to also understand better what is meant by climate justice, how can climate justice be centered in their work, how can approaches that are being trialed in many, many countries by many different players on just transition, what do they look like in practice, and how can we work together to increase funding, to shift resources, both power as well as resources to the field. So I'm really delighted that we're having this webinar. We've had 4 of these, actually, 5 if you include a half-day conference which took place in Glasgow at the end of the first week, which also discussed issues relating to the role of philanthropy in pushing and promoting and being good allies in the climate justice and just transition space. So in fact, this is the second of the webinars on climate finance, which is such a critical issue, so necessary for us to address that climate change wasn't caused by equally by us all, and that finance is a crucial component of setting right the injustices, as well as allowing people to live and become more resilient in the face of ever-growing devastating impacts. The other features of these webinars is that we try and take as an intersectional an approach as possible, and try and especially platform and showcase the work and the voice of historically marginalized communities, of women, people of color, Indigenous people, youth. So the webinars that we've had have actually reflected those priorities. We had a webinar just before Glasgow, which was entirely run by Indigenous people and focused on energy issues. Essentially, it was energy transition issues relating to Indigenous peoples. We've had one organized again by the field on agroecology, which was looking at whether agroecology can be a way forward to get away from a land use and food system that is very destructive. And we now have this one, which follows on from, as I said, the one in Glasgow, which we looked at, for example, issues of how loss and damage can be addressed, how impacts can be dealt with on an immediate basis. So there's a little flyer that tells people more about the work of the collaborative. We hope to keep going and have more webinars really welcoming philanthropy, those who work with and for foundations, as well as those who are in the field and who want to know and co-design and think through these problems together, to please join us. I think in the chat function, my colleagues in the collaborative will put details of our next webinar in the chat function. And I'm really, really pleased about that particular webinar, because it's going to look at issues of racial justice and look at how philanthropy can be decolonized. So that's a really exciting topic, and I think that's going to be on the 1st of July. So please take a minute to download the webinar. We will also be sending that out, and put that date in your diary. Just before I turn over to Hugo, I want to say a huge thanks to the foundations that have made possible this collaborative and have stepped up and said that they are in a position of learning, that they want to understand better and listen to the field, be more responsive to the field. And so my thanks goes to Porticus, where Hugo is, the Climate Justice Resilience Fund, which was the initial instigator and organized this collaborative. I want to thank the Oak Foundation, Climate Works, the IKEA Foundation, the Bosch Foundation, and also colleagues at Impatience and Impatience Earth, who have been helping pull together this effort, because philanthropy is a sector in its own right. It has a huge impact on many different fields, and we feel that this is an important way in which we can collaborate and co-design solutions. So without further ado, let me turn over to Hugo, who has kindly is kindly going to moderate this panel, and thank him. And each one of the webinars is led by one of the foundations or one of the partners who try and collaborate in the spirit of us co-creating and co-designing a way forward. So over to you, Hugo. Thank you.
Thank you, Farhana. Welcome, everybody. My name is Hugo Hoyer. I will be moderating this panel. In my day job, I work for Porticus, a private philanthropy supporting climate action all around the world. In this webinar, we want to talk about the current state of play in climate finance. So we will be talking about the famous 100 billion US dollars that should be made available each year by rich countries to support climate action in developing countries. The purpose of climate finance should be to meet the needs of the most vulnerable communities, and we'll be discussing to what extent climate finance is currently delivering on that promise, and also looking at the things that would need to change in climate finance governance, so the decision-making structures around climate finance in order to meet this purpose. We will look ahead at the future decision-making moments on international climate finance for developing countries, starting with COP27 this year, but also the years after. And lastly, we will, in the last bit of this webinar, we will be talking about what philanthropies can do to support the changes that we need. I will try to, this is probably the most you will hear from me. We have a great panel of 5 speakers here, all with great experience in climate finance. I will introduce them to you shortly. First of all, we have Niranjali Amerasinje. I'm hoping I pronounced that right. She is from ActionAid USA. Next, we have Salim Hook from the International Center for Climate Change and Development. We have Dana Schran from Transparency International, Joshua Amponsem from the Green Africa Youth Organization, and Angelique Pouponneau from the Alliance of Small Island States. They will be sharing their knowledge and expertise on climate finance, and hopefully also we'll be hearing a few of their opinions on what needs to change. So kicking right off with the first bit of this webinar, trying to set the scene and looking at climate finance, what it's supposed to be doing. How can climate finance be a tool for climate justice? Angelique, I would like to start with you. Do you think that climate finance can be a tool for climate justice?
Thank you very much, Hugo, and greetings everyone. Greetings from New York. Thanks for that question. Absolutely, climate finance can be a tool for climate justice, and it's very clear when you come from a small island developing states. Islands are particularly vulnerable. They have contributed the least to the threat of climate change, and yet are facing the brunt of the impacts of climate. But in facing the brunt of the impacts of climate, we need to continue to build resilience. We need to continue to adapt. And for us to do that, of course, we need finance. And as such, in order to support these efforts, climate finance is critical. And it cannot just be the availability of finance. There needs to be accessibility, and it needs to be reaching the most vulnerable communities. And that is the only in which we can fully assure ourselves that climate justice will follow. It's not just about quantity, it is very much about quantity and quality. I have much to say, but I will leave it there for open. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's very clear. Joshua, representing young people in Africa, what do you think climate finance is currently doing for young people in Africa? Does it make a change?
Thanks. And I would absolutely agree with Angelique on her points that she made. In addition to that, for young people, access to finance gives hope. And that is very important. when you are hit by a cyclone, and in the rebuilding phase, you're hit by another cyclone, and you are run out of resources to rebuild. You are out of hope. You are out of, your future is basically taken away from you. Let me put it that way. So you are living in fear and anxiety for what will happen the next year, which means that your whole life is being bet on what will happen with the next hazard, which could become a disaster. But hazards don't have to be a disaster. This is where justice becomes important. If we get the finance to invest in building reinforced and resilient infrastructure for young people, we are giving them a future which they rightfully deserve, by the way. It's not something that we have to now go back for. It's something that is owned. You already should have that, but we don't have it. You know, if I look at Cyclone Idai, if I look at floods now happening in Durban, in South Africa, in Accra, in Ghana, if I look at the floods that happen in India, Pakistan, I just came back from the Philippines where Typhoon Odette happened 5 months ago. And it's really young people who are reconstructing everything. And yet their input will not even go into climate policy because they will not even be consulted on this. So finance can really help build movement at the local level, strengthen the capacity of youth organizations and young people on the ground, and bring their lived experiences in raising ambition, but also giving them hope that it is possible that the future that they rightfully deserve can be available to them and not taken away from them.
Great, thank you. Niranjali, as a global network, what does Action Aid do on climate finance? Can you say something about this?
Sure. So there's a couple of ways we interact with this. We engage at the policy levels to support the calls of local movements for more climate finance. And I will say that climate finance is a central component of climate justice, right? We can't talk about climate justice without talking about the money that is needed to address climate change, to deal with resilience issues, and especially for communities and peoples who have done the least to cause the problem, right? So it's an essential component, and that's something that we raise up quite a bit. We also do programming work in many vulnerable places. And this is where I want to reinforce things that both Angelique and Joshua have said, where finance is absolutely essential to ensuring that those most affected have decision-making power, right? And it matters how you channel the finance, because often I see an elitism in the climate finance world where we don't give the same weight to local communities, to local knowledge, to traditional knowledge, to indigenous peoples as we do the experts who are college educated. Right, and a lot of our engagement in our programming is about that grassroots work and making sure that those who are most affected by climate change, by other disasters, by other development challenges, have the power through the money that's channeled to connect with decision makers and ensure that the solutions that they're bringing to the table are connected with the expertise that exists, right? Because that's where the powerful and durable solutions last. Thank you.
And which decision makings are these? Where are they? Are they on national levels or international levels?
It's at every level, right? And it goes up. There's local level decision making, whether you're talking about municipalities or provincial systems, and then there's central government decisions, and then there's regional, if you're talking about multiple countries, and then there's international. And often we just see, we don't see enough connective tissue between the local voices and the local solutions and what's happening at national, regional, and international levels. And I will say some of that is down to what I define as an obsession with efficiency and cost effectiveness, right? You want the big projects, you want the big things. And to have things more local and to scale at local levels has higher transaction costs. It's decentralized. And we have to get more comfortable with that in the climate finance world if we're going to actually have positive impacts for the people affected most.
Great, thank you. Angelique and Joshua, can you explain a little bit about how your work relates to this? Maybe Angelique first.
No, thanks for that. And I mean, work I'd like to draw on my previous role as well as my present role. So in a previous role, I used to lead a conservation trust fund that was very much supporting local communities on the ground, grassroots community engagement, and accessing finance for climate adaptation. And this is one avenue of making sure there is actually access to those who mostly need it. And with this knowledge and with this really very much practical experience of managing funds and ensuring that it's reaching the local communities has then subsequently helped me in ensuring that we're thinking about these critical points when making decisions at the international level. So part of my role is also sitting on the Adaptation Fund board, where much of that decision is taken. I'm happy to share more about my views as it relates to financial mechanisms and whether it is suited as it stands to actually deliver on climate justice. I think that is a critical question that we need to ask ourselves and think about what reforms and what plans we need to put in place to be able to ensure that they are all fit for purpose. But in my current role, I'm a policy advisor to the Alliance of Small Island States and very much providing advice to the membership, to our 39 island nations, to be able to think about how we're influencing international negotiations, how we're having strong positions to make sure that climate finance is being delivered, as well as it's being delivered in a way that is fit for purpose and addressing needs urgently. Again, all tying back to these much needed critical thinking about the financial mechanisms that we currently have in place and whether they are fit for purpose.
Great. We'll be talking more about the fit for purpose question in the next section. So then we'll come back to you. Joshua?
Yes, thanks. I think from my side, with the work that Green Africa Youth Organization is doing and with the other youth movement that we're working with, finance being available and how we're channeling that is we need to build local capacity. And building local capacity means we need to trust organizations with resources. Trusting them with resources means that they are able to better function efficiently on the ground, and there's less reliance on northern organizations coming in to fix problems that could be easily done by southern-based and locally based organizations. And this is fundamentally how we are doing it, by channeling resources, giving opportunities to locally led, locally founded, locally managed organizations who, by the way, are the first respondents to any of this climate crisis we're talking about. When disasters strike, when there is food prices hikes, whatever happens, it's going to be local organizations who are going to deal with it first. And hence, it's very redundant. And if you look at it from just a logical perspective, it's really insane that you get a fact-finding mission that comes into a country for 3 days to gather data, go plan a solution, and then fly in again to come and implement that, and then give peanuts of resources to local organizations, and a bunch of that goes into M&E. Like, really? I mean, so this is what has to stop. And that means that our organizations need to start stepping up and start asking for us to be trusted with resources. And the traditional argument of, if you've not managed 50,000 before, I cannot give you 50,000. If you've not managed 100,000 before, I cannot give you 100. So every philanthropic is asking you, how much have you managed? And they're going to give you something equivalent. Well, excuse me to say, the UN has mismanaged worse, and they still get money. So there's no excuse. And big organizations have all mismanaged huge amounts of money, and they are still trusted with resources. So that excuse has to be eliminated. We need to trust that when you have resources, you make better decisions. When you are desperate, you make poor decisions. If you keep locally led organizations desperate, they will not be able to support, and they will not be able to deliver with the intelligence, the local resources, and the networks and the social capital they have cannot be deployed to its maximum efficiency. And this is what Green Africa Youth Organization is doing with our youth network. And this is what I think every organization should be doing now. It's an international global problem. We're going to have to solve it locally in any ways. We have to learn from each other, but we're not going to solve this by this, what we've been doing for many years, which is carving solutions somewhere, exporting it like how you ship a product from one place to the other. and just put a price tag on it and expect people to buy it and it's supposed to work. No. So this is the key message for me in terms of how we are doing this. This is how we're doing it. And we want as many organizations to believe in this approach and to be able to work with it.
Hear, hear. Great, thank you, Joshua. Moving on with the next section, we want to look at the governance structure of climate finance. Now, this may sound a little bit vague, but with governance structure, we mean both the decision making and the institutions that are involved in channeling climate finance from rich countries to developing countries. Now, this is a wide array of things, really. There are multiple institutions involved. Climate finance can flow directly from donor governments to via their embassies in developing countries to local projects, or through multilateral funds, through the World Bank. The Green Climate Fund is a famous example. Obviously, there's more routes. And climate finance is a very heterogeneous bucket, really. There's lots of different streams of funding in there. There's public finance, there's private finance, there's grants, there's loans, there's private investments, etc. So it's quite there's not one single stream. That's what I want to point out. As such, there are many governing bodies involved in the decision making around climate finance. So Salim, moving on to you, how do you see the current governance structure for climate finance? Would you say this is functional and serving the purpose of climate finance?
Well, thank you very much. So a couple of points. If you look at the Working Group 2 report of the 6th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that was published on the 28th of February, just a few weeks ago, they made two very, very important points. Firstly, that the pace of finance to support adaptation to climate change, which is now already happening, is very, very slow and needs to be doubled, if not tripled, if not quadrupled. And that message actually resonated in COP26 by the developed countries promising to initially double the amount of money they're providing for adaptation. But there's a second order message in that IPCC report where the scientists looked at the actual delivery of finance that has been given. There has been given some money from the global to the national to the local. And they found that less than 10% of the money that was given actually reached the most vulnerable people, as we just heard. And that is a failure, an absolute failure. So the system of delivering is not fit for purpose. So even if they double the amount of money, if it's not reaching the people it's supposed to reach, then it's not going to do much good. And one of the IPCC findings was that in some cases where they looked at what the money did, it actually didn't help anybody. And some places it made things worse than they were before. They were supposed to help, but they ended up doing what they call maladaptation, doing the wrong thing. And so we need to think of not just quantity, but quality. And I will reiterate what Joshua just said. One of the biggest impediments is allowing small groups of community-led actors to get small amounts of money. The big donors are just simply not good at doing that. We managed to get a grant of less than $30,000 from the Climate Justice Resilience Fund to grant in $5,000 chunks to communities. We have a network of local actors called the Gobeshona Locally Led Adaptation Resilience Network. We solicited proposals. We then gave those proposals for the network members to vote on. And in fact, just yesterday, we got the final vote in. More than 3,000 votes came in. We got the top 5 applications agreed now, and we are going to give them $5,000 grants each. It's a very small amount of money, only $25,000 across 5 different organizations. But this is the second time we're doing it. We did it last year very successfully, and we are now doing it again. So these are possible if we are willing to be somewhat flexible, somewhat able to be quick and get the money to the people who need it as quickly as possible. That to me is the number one criteria. People are suffering as we speak. You know, I'm speaking to you from Dhaka, Bangladesh, where we just had a heat wave and we didn't have the worst of it. The worst of it was next door in India and Pakistan, where the temperatures went over 50 degrees. And that's attributable to climate change, by the way. They're absolutely attributable to human-induced climate change. So we are now suffering impacts, we are suffering losses and damages, and we're not getting enough money. So we need to get enough money. More money, yes, but the right kind of money to the right places, even more important in my view. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Salim. Dana, moving on to you. How do you see, what do you think needs to change in the governance of climate finance?
Yeah, thanks, Hugo, and thanks to the organizers for this great event. And I'm already feeling really refreshed by hearing a lot of echoes among the speakers and also getting an injection of new energy on this topic, which I'm really excited that is being discussed because it's often overlooked. But when you ask what's holding us back and what needs to shift, what comes directly to mind is a very stark statistic from a study conducted by some of our colleagues in Bangladesh, which assessed climate projects implemented on the ground and found an estimated 35% of all funds lost to corruption, just 35%, and which was a result of embezzlement. And nearly 80% of those projects were found to be poorly constructed. So that's really echoing to the T what Salim is also communicating on. And for us, this figure is the clear evidence and vibrantly flashing warning signal that there can be no climate justice unless commitments and pledges are honored and money does not reach communities who are most in need due to effects of the climate crisis. And it's in our experience that these 2 points I just mentioned usually occur, often occur, almost always occur due to some form of corruption, which has limited, curbed, diluted, or stopped these actions from taking place. And before I get further into this answering this loaded question with a loaded answer, I should first make sure we're on the same page by defining what I mean when I say corruption. So we define corruption as the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. And this definition is really important because it alludes directly to the power imbalance, which is at the center of the interplay between corruption and achieving climate justice. And aside from the type of corruption embezzlement that I just mentioned, what's often misunderstood is that there are many forms of corruption that can manifest, especially in climate finance space. We actually have compiled a database called the Climate Corruption Case Atlas, which puts together different instances from global north and global south of what corruption actually looks like in climate finance. And it's used as a tool to not only monitor, but also as a tool to look at cases of failure and learnings and learn how to be better and to mitigate and prevent integrity issues and gaps that arise where corruption could fall into the cracks. And we're looking at building a layer based on our work in the field. I should mention that we've been working in the climate governance space for almost 10 years. We're celebrating our 10-year anniversary this year. But we work together all around the world with our local partners, who we call chapters, to address integrity issues in climate finance and how projects are made and how communities are involved. And so we've seen a lot in the last decade. So we're looking also at building a layer into this database that I just mentioned, which has kind of some good best practices and good governance examples. And I won't go into all of them, but I would name some like 3 that I think are really important and are very pervasive and sometimes can be very simple just when thinking about it logically, but are often never implemented. So number 1, there's a need for a guarantee of independence in environmental protection institutions and an assurance of the integrity of key processes like environmental impact assessments. A second area, which is very important, is safe and easily accessible complaints mechanisms and whistleblower channels. I believe Joshua was mentioning that oftentimes local communities are the first respondents. And it also is in our experience that local communities, environmental defenders are extremely important in raising the red flag of corruption and in covering any misuse of funds. And it makes the whole process much more expedited when we can have communities that feel safe and know how to access these mechanisms to voice these issues. And thirdly, I would point to a point that I think all of the speakers have already mentioned, is that ensuring there's a very significant pillar of inclusive decision-making, which involves communities, and how these projects are set up, and how the funding is used. Participation can enhance relevance and the need of interventions, and can prevent the maladaptation that Salim was mentioning. So it's kind of like a double win if we just would involve the communities that are affected, especially when they're locally led initiatives. It can really help in supporting monitoring the integrity and governance of climate action efforts. And we're actually looking together with the Robert Bosch Foundation at how to support local communities and local initiatives in monitoring the Great Green Wall Project initiative in Niger. So that's something that we're looking forward to expand upon, and also yield some more social accountability issues in the Sahel. But I leave it at that and hand back to you, Hugo.
Great, thank you, Dana. Very insightful. Angelique, I promised I would get back to you. Thinking of what needs to change in the current structure of climate finance, can you reflect on what do you think are the most important changes that need to happen now?
Yeah, no, thanks, Hugo. So, I mean, one of the changes that certainly needs to happen in the climate structure is moving away from just a project proposal type approach. We've seen in the past where there are issues of capacity with drafting these extensive project proposals. It's then taking a significant amount of time to process these. They're coming back asking for more information. And you know, we were just in the Maldives discussing the global goal on adaptation last week, and it was fascinating that one of the funds came back saying to the Maldives, well, you need to now go back and find the funding to undertake research of coastal erosion and data points for so many years. So the Maldives actually had to go and raise funds to undertake research to then be able to access funding for an urgent issue. Urgency is the urgency for the funds are certainly not aligning to the delivery of the funds. And this is something that urgently needs to be addressed. That's one aspect. We also need to think about, so just not time, but also approach. It is very much project by project, whereby it's often seen to be disjointed. It's often seen to be very focused on a particular sector. We need to move to a more programmatic approach. We're not saying that there is no space for a project approach, but it needs to be complemented for a more programmatic approach. So that's certainly one of the things that we would certainly like to see in terms of changes. And I think there's an opportunity for this when thinking about how we're structuring and designing the operationalization of the Santiago network on loss and damage. Early discussions seem to be suggesting that we are moving back to a project approach. And when it comes to loss and damage, that's just not going to be acceptable given the variety of issues that we're facing and the urgency of the different impacts of climate change. So in that respect, I think we need to think about how more efficiently and effectively we're delivering on climate change. I completely agree with the previous speaker who, you know, we've got this obsession with cost effectiveness and other factors, which I think we need to perhaps prioritize more urgency and delivering to those who need it, more so than just feeling content with ourselves that we have dotted the I's and crossed the T's. Thanks.
Thank you, Angelique. Moving on then to the next section where we want to look ahead at the opportunities that lie ahead to make change. Firstly, looking at there will be intersessionals next month in Bonn. COP27 will take place in Sharm el-Sheikh in November. After that, there will be many more COPs to come. I was wondering, and this is a question to all panelists, Niranjali, Joshua, Angelique, Salim, Dana, please all feel welcome to reflect on this. Which opportunities do you see to make change? And maybe you could also reflect on what is needed to make those changes happen, which efforts are needed. Who would like to start? Salim, go ahead.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. Great question. So I'm sure everybody's aware that in the UNFCCC process in COP26, the vulnerable countries asked for and indeed had draft text in the final version of the Glasgow Climate Pact, creating what we call the Glasgow Facility for Finance for Loss and Damage. And loss and damage is really the cutting edge of climate justice. If you're using the term climate justice, then the climate injustice of losses and damages suffered by poorest people on the planet, caused by the richest people on the planet, doesn't get any more climate unjust than that. And so in the UNFCCC in COP26, unfortunately, after it was postponed by an extra day by the COP26 presidency, we came back the day later. That wording had been downgraded from a Glasgow Facility for Finance to a Glasgow Dialogue on Finance, and not just 1 year dialogue, but 3 years of dialogue. So they're going to talk for 3 years, as Greta Thunberg says, blah, 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 for 3 years without giving us any funding. So we intend to take that forward. There is going to be a dialogue in Bonn from the 7th of June. We'll participate in it. We're going to see and push for the facility itself to be set up in COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh this November, and then it can be fleshed out and developed over the next year by COP28. These things always take time. We know that, but we can start the ball rolling and not just talk about doing things, but actually start doing things. But more importantly than the UNFCCC, there is now already a small amount of funding, relatively small, but very, very important funding coming from a number of philanthropies that are part of this consortium as well as the Scottish government, who kicked it off with First Minister Nicola Sturgeon offering initially £1 million and then doubling it to £2 million. The president of Wallonia in Belgium offering €1 million. So there is a pot of money that is now already making the rounds, making it available to help people. And the most recent initiative that I would like to flag is something that the Climate Vulnerable Forum countries, the finance ministers of the forum called the V20, have set up. They have a multi-donor fund of their own run by the UN with their money, and they have opened a loss and damage window for supporting the victims of loss and damage in reality on the ground. And they are soliciting support from whoever wants to give them. And perhaps the foundation and philanthropy sector might look at them as a conduit of actually getting money to the victims of climate change. That is by far the biggest priority right now. Get the money to the people who need it, who are actually suffering as we speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Salim. Anyone else who wants to respond to this? Dana, go ahead.
Yeah, I can take a go at it. I mean, I think we're seeing a lot of positive steps being taken after COP26. I mean, there was a lot of restrictions and inclusive participation. I mean, which partly understandably so because of the health situation, but it also led to a lot of closed doors and decisions being made, again, without including civil society or observers. It's very great to see that the UNFCCC is taking some steps, such as starting this observer review process, and also Action for Climate Empowerment, which is called ACE, to kind of re-examine how they can better include participants or observers in the negotiations and in discussions. So that's positive. It's great to see that they recognize it finally and that they're doing something about it. Of course, as Salim mentioned, that these things take time and there's discussions and it's not going to happen right away. Hopefully it happens. There are changes made already at COP27, but let's see. But I mean, despite these positive developments, there's of course still some worrying issues that are still there. That we need to address. I mean, when I think about the ACE process, there needs to be a formal seat at the table for Indigenous peoples and also civil society actors. And that's just at the UNFCCC process. And then when I kind of take a step back and we look at the global stocktake, when countries will be submitting what they've done and what actions they've taken with the funding they've received, there's a clear issue with the Paris Agreement and the Compliance Committee, and there needs to be a look at how to strengthen the accountability here to make sure that there's a role for non-party stakeholders to monitor these commitments, and it's not just a box-ticking exercise for yourself or for that country to complete. And there needs to be a look at how to enhance the existing peer review process and build something more robust, which has implications and potentially sanctions similar to the World Trade Organization or the IMF, et cetera. And then just a second point that I would add is that something that we, Transparency International, has been really looking at since last year around COP26 and that we think is very important, is the issue of undue influence, where industry exerts influence on climate policy, resulting in exactly what we're discussing now: transition delayed, climate pledges not met. And so we put together a briefing on exactly this topic. We also called on the UK COP26 presidency to address undue influence at the COP and made some recommendations and calling for a conflict of interest policy to make sure that in the national delegations, there aren't industry representatives actively diluting and diverting action that is really sorely needed. And this is something we continue to call for, and we're continuing to discuss with the COP26 presidency and discussing in climate spaces like upcoming intersessional meetings in Bonn this June. Because unfortunately, in our experience, it's a tough issue to solve. It's complex. And so far, the actors at play are dragging their feet, unfortunately. And I would just also add that something that also needs to change is we have a loose coalition which is looking at the issue of undue influence. And I think it's really important to be cultivating coalitions that can kind of coordinate their aims and actions around Bonn and COP26 to include voices who are affected in different ways from many different sectors, to make sure that we're all collectively working on different pieces and issues to kind of have this collective push. I would leave it at that and let the others respond.
Thank you, Dana. Angelique, what kind of opportunities do you see lying ahead?
Yeah, in terms of opportunities, I think I'll highlight three. And of course, my area of work is mostly focused on adaptation, so I'll take that focus. So one is making the best use of the IPCC report. I think that it's critical that we highlight the findings there. And many of the findings are clear, unequivocal. One, I think is always worth saying, is that link between the need for mitigation, the lack of mitigation increases the need for adaptation. And then, of course, its linkage with loss and damage, right? So without bringing temperatures down, without curbing emissions, we're going to have more needs to adapt. But the other thing that's mostly linked to climate finance is, without finance to be able to adapt, and a delay in finance to adapt is also going to aggravate the situation. And this is something that's come out very clearly. And another aspect, therefore, another opportunity, therefore, is the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program on the global goal on adaptation, the GLAS, as some people refer to it. There's going to be a lot of discussions there about support and the absence of support for adaptation. And I think it's going to come out very strongly there that a lot of the international finance structures will need to be adjusted, altered, changed to be able to respond to adaptation needs and to be able to provide the urgent adaptation action required. And as such, what we hope to see is learnings from that work program really translating and infiltrating other areas of work, including the finance stream. And finally, nice to see the doubling of adaptation finance. Great pledge. But at the same time, we know it's not sufficient. But we're not going to wait for deadlines like we did with the 100 billion. We want to see a delivery plan now to see when these things are going to be delivered. How are they going to be channeled, especially with small island developing states where in the last standing committee on finance report, we saw that we received less or just about 2% of climate finance from bilateral. And when we look at multilateral, it's just about 10% going to the most vulnerable countries. So we really need to think about how these are being channeled. If it's being channeled purely bilaterally, we know that many island nations do not have access because of ODA eligibility. And as such, we want to make sure that it's being channeled through funding mechanisms that make sure that it is predictable, adequate, and sustainable for island nations. So we want to see the delivery plan. We want to see by when, and we wanted to start flowing now. So those would be sort of three main opportunities: IPCC report, making sure the GLAS informs the finance discussions, as well as a delivery plan on the doubling of adaptation finance. Thanks.
Wonderful. That's very clear. Thank you. Joshua, on to you.
Yes, thanks to all the wonderful input so far on this. I think that the opportunity for COP27 around this is, we need to build evidence for adaptation. And that requires funding for research, for the conversation we're having. As Salim rightfully said, even if we double the money, it doesn't do anyone good if the money ends up in the wrong place. For that to happen, we need evidence to show where the money needs to land and what impact it could have. And on top of that, we need to understand how does this deliver multiple benefits. And while I agree that there's a push against sort of private sector, and they are lobbying around all of this, which makes it very difficult for all of us, we need to build better stories ourselves. And that is the opportunity we have for COP27. I mean, we can always fight private sector, and we've been fighting them, but we need them equally to provide the finance that we need. They're making money, they're making money, they're going to thrive, and we're going to suffer. And the better we can sell the story to them and be able to mobilize finance that allow us to be able to tackle the problem, the better it is. So I think the opportunity from now to COP27, we need massive movement building. And there we need young people's involvement in building the adaptation story. Ahead of COP26, Green Africa Youth Organization, the Youth Climate Lab, the few other partners, we did a series of workshops across the Global South, and we published a paper called Youth Voices for Climate Action. And if you look at that, some of the clear demands that were made were around evidence building, which we can definitely rely on young people's experiences to build that evidence, that if funding flows, people thrive, communities thrive. And we might not have large-scale evidence for adaptation, which I know ODI has spent a lot of years working on it. I did my master research on this. Having large-scale adaptation evidence is difficult because adaptation is not like mitigation. It's not something you can just measure. 2 + 2 is 4, and it's that straightforward. No, we're talking about children having a better life in the future. Should we wait 40 years and see them become adults before we get results and mobilize funding? No, we don't have time for that. But we can rely on the micro projects that young people are leading to gather evidence to be able to do that. But together with the Global Center on Adaptation, we have the Youth Call to Action on adaptation, which also laid down really very straightforward support that can be given to young people in terms of research, in terms of education, and in terms of capacity to mobilize, to be able to support the call for finance on adaptation and reaching the right places. But typically, the momentum simply drops the moment that we had COP26 and Adaptation Fund were able to raise the biggest funding they've ever raised, which was great news, but it was still a very small quota. So everyone get a little bit satisfied with the few progress we're able to get in these climate conferences. And we have to wait for a whole year before we convene for another simple progress, a very little progress again. And I think that the movement building and the advocacy should be every day, every single time, together with public sector, private sector, government, working with everybody to make sure that we can mobilize as much finance as possible, have enough of that finance going into research that builds on evidence or evidence-based financing that makes it easy to even mobilize more private sector financing to support this. And at COP27 in Egypt, be able to set a landmark sort of vision of being able to support as many locally led organizations as possible who can deliver actual impact on the ground. And by COP28, present evidence of that, which should allow us to be mobilized more funding to go directly to communities. And like I said before, the issues around corruption in the global South countries, and corruption is everywhere, it's going to be there. We cannot rely on that to prevent us from making progress. That would always going to be there one way or the other. We need to build better argument, better story, better narrative. The positivity and the progress that is achieved has to be communicated more, and we need more people to join on the good side. But if we keep preventing progress based on, say, corruption, then we're not going to be able to build positive narratives as well. So this will be for me, this is the opportunity we have, that we can mobilize, build movement, build evidence for COP27, set a vision for ourselves, be able to implement landmark projects that can allow us at COP28 even radicalize a lot of really large-scale finance that can go to locally led organizations.
Thank you, Joshua. Neuranjali, we haven't heard from you. What opportunities do you see for the next COP and maybe the time after?
Yeah, so a lot has been said, and I don't want to repeat. So I'll build on this thread of inspiration, right, and stories, because the stories are there, and I see this in our federation where we do our programming work is done through local rights programs, right? So it's alongside local partners, and often we're doing multi-country work with local partners to see where we can kind of bridge from experiences across different countries. And the inspirational stories of locally led work is there. Like, we've been doing a ton of work on agroecology, and we actually can see over the years, yes, these are actual solutions that if we did this on a meaningful level, we're not going to need the industrial model in the way that we have developed it for agriculture, as an example, right? Like, there are these alternatives. So I do think where we can tell better stories and narratives and bring them forward, there are these opportunities to change. And of course, that needs the political willingness, of course, from those who hold power. And that's where so much of our work in the Federation is about trying to shift power to local people, because we see so much potential for the progress that they have made. And I sort of, on the funding side of it, this is specifically for philanthropy, but it also applies to the broader finance channels. That need for sustained investment, right? And the upfront capacity investment, that's what's going to get you the gains at the end of the day. Some of the projects that we've done, it's a 10-year time horizon, right? And the first 3 years were about building that accountable network, building that structure. That's how you get the safeguards and all of those things you need to make sure that money is flowing to the right places. So we've said this before, we've been saying this for years, but I'll say it again, that sustained, dedicated investment and the upfront investment in capacity and research, you need that. You need that if you want to get to sort of going from point A to point B. The last thing I'll say, and this is, I am going wide, like really wide here, and it's not just an opportunity for COP27, but I think it's looking forward. But one of the things that became really clear, I think many of us have known this who have been in the field, but I think sort of the broader consciousness of society through COVID and managing these triple crises of COVID, debt, and climate is that the sort of the neoliberal macroeconomic ethic that we have followed largely in the international finance world doesn't work. And it's not serving people, and it needs to change. I've seen this most powerfully at the moment in the IMF, right, where they're suddenly re-emerging as this global leader, and they want to do a lot of things on climate change, but they're trying to do it with the same kinds of austerity policies and fiscal consolidation that they've used for decades that haven't helped developing countries. And we can talk about the corruption at government level, right? But when governments are desperate, as Joshua was saying, right, when you're desperate, you make poor choices. When you are in dire debt, right, and then you have to take on more debt to do climate work, it just doesn't make sense. And we need to change that. And my sense is that there is movement building around this that can happen, right? And we need people to be telling their governments across the globe that we need to break this dynamic. And it takes sort of, I think, for developing countries to say, look, our people are demanding something dramatically different than what you're giving us. And then for those of us who are situated in northern countries to be pushing our governments to change what they're pushing forward and change the dynamics and the assumptions of economics that the big financial institutions are pushing. We need that. And I know that's a massive task and a big thing to think about, but we're there. And I do think there's opportunities for us to push on that front and make some changes.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you, Niranjali. Before we move on to the group discussion, taking questions from the audience, I want to just spend like last 2 minutes by talking about the role of philanthropy. Is there anything in particular that you feel that and this is a question to all, that philanthropy should be doing or should not be doing, and maybe also in regard to what other donors are doing, for example, governments. Salim, go ahead.
Great, thank you very much. So let me just pick up from what Niranjali said. I think philanthropy has a major ability to be a bit risk-taking where the traditional development donors simply cannot do that. And you are in a position to do some experiments, and as Niranjali said, invest in building capacity at the ground level, because it doesn't exist. You know, if you ask small communities to have all the capacities and do due diligence, they're not going to fail. They're all going to fail. The problem with the Green Climate Fund, for example, is impossible to get money out of them because they take ages and years. And, you know, in my view, that's worse than corruption. They're wasting money. They're sitting on it and not spending it. That is worse than having given it to people and 10% gets taken out by corruption. At least 90% gets used well. And so, you know, I think this bogey of corruption is sometimes used as a cudgel against giving money to people to help them. And so philanthropists are in a position to experiment, to be flexible, to learn from experience. There may be some failures. We learn from those failures. Failure is not a bad thing. We can learn from them. And so that's something I would appeal to the philanthropist community to figure out ways to do that, particularly to support local groups who are suffering the impacts of climate change. Either do loss and damage if you're interested in that, or do adaptation if you're interested in that, but do something. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Anyone wants to respond to that or add to that? Angelique?
Yeah, no, thanks. And I concur with what others have said before. And I mean, just to say that, of course, philanthropy is not going to replace public finance. And that's always very important to highlight. But they have a complementary role to play. And I wanted to share just an experience from the Seychelles as it relates to the Debt for Nature swap, where philanthropy was able to support a small island nation to raise the financing to buy back their debt, and then to have it restructured in more favorable terms. Of course, philanthropy also comes with their own interests and motivations. And I think that's always worth keeping in mind when engaging with philanthropy. But in so doing, it introduces blended finance as another opportunity when it comes to climate adaptation financing. It allows us to leverage public funds to attract, whether it is private capital, whether it is philanthropy, philanthropic dollars. So that's, of course, is helpful in attracting more financing, the more urgently needed financing to these island nations. So I think that there's definitely a role, and I concur with what Celine has said in terms of they're able to take more risks, and in taking more risks, they're able to propel more solutions, because traditional funds are less risk takers. So we're not able to test new solutions. So by having philanthropy come into the arena, they're able to provide us with opportunities for more solutions that can then be scaled up, that can then be replicated, as is the case with some of what we've seen in the Seychelles. So that's definitely one of the roles that they can play. And the other aspect that they've also been very forthcoming with is actually absorbing some of the transactional costs of these initiatives, whether it is legal costs, whether it is capacity building costs. And these are things that are much needed because, of course, governments, private sector are less inclined to invest such big, large amounts of money into things that they're not entirely sure will work. So this is when philanthropy can definitely step in to provide that support. Yeah, thank you. My reflection.
Thank you, Angelique. Dana?
Yeah, thanks. It's really enlightening to hear all of these responses, and I'm taking notes to take it back to the drawing board and rethink how we're approaching these things. So thanks again for this event. But I would just first mention that we actually have a blog specifically on this question, which gives 6 actions philanthropy should embrace in stopping the climate crisis. So I won't go through and list them all. And also most of the points brought up are already echoed in some of the points I mentioned, and answering some of your questions related to making sure communities have a seat at the table and monitoring abuses. So we have a robust foundation of research to act on and learn from. But what I would really like to emphasize here, and also maybe challenge the other panelists who mentioned corruption as kind of just a cost of doing business. In our view, we can't afford it. We can't afford to have 10, 30, 40, upwards. I've seen estimates of 60% of funding being lost to corruption in climate finance. It's very difficult to track, as you mentioned, Hugo, that there's sources coming from all sides, and how it's being administered and governed is nearly impossible to track. So often when we hear these statistics, it's usually just the tip of the iceberg. So I would say that this is something very much overlooked and often used as a checklist ticking box exercise and a framework when donors are rolling out their funding. But there needs to be funding specifically for these actions to make sure someone is taking care of how communities can make sure there's integrity and how they can counteract corruption that could manifest itself in their own local communities, and also at the decision-making level when industries are being having influential positions to speak to policymakers and really delaying the really urgently needed finance. So we really need to support anti-corruption interventions, and also I think, alluding to Naranjali, I'm so sorry for butchering your name, but I really like the points that you mentioned about having a paradigm shift. I really think this is extremely necessary if we want to get anywhere, especially when we think about corruption. We really need to call out and hold those accountable for kleptocrats, and making sure that money that is earmarked for those who need it gets there. And then just a final point about maybe a word of caution for philanthropy is when funding new solutions and new ideas, we need to be very cautious to make sure that they're not false solutions, not this greenwashing. We're actually having a brief published around Bonn, as well as on the corruption risks and uptake of new climate technology. Oftentimes this technology is not new, and oftentimes it's just a repackaged approach, which doesn't often yield any better results. So I leave it there. Thank you.
Joshua, you're the last one, and then we move on to the Q&A. Thank you.
Great. I actually raised my hand because of a question I read, so I'm probably already transitioning us into Q&A.
All right, go ahead.
I see the question from Nasib, if I mention your name correctly, around corruption, sort of forestry in Mexico and how to overcome this, and if I have any experiences. The way that we've tackled corruption in the past, and my main point around corruption is it shouldn't be an impediment for financial flow. That's my main concern. It's something we have to deal with, but it shouldn't prevent financial flow, and it shouldn't be a reason why donors and those who have resources use as an excuse to prevent money from flowing. But how we've tackled this in the past is really by a citizen-led education. If people don't know and people are not aware, it's very easy to mislead. We should always be aware of this, that education always becomes a fundamental factor in all these things we're talking about. If people don't know and they don't understand, you can easily mislead them. And that is the strength of the industry. And that's the strength of every corrupt system, that you can mislead people into a whole darkness and they will not even have any clue. So our part of that process is mobilizing information and making them as easily accessible as possible and circulating information in a way that, aside accessibility, that you can easily comprehend it. So recently, we have a situation in Ghana where a forest is up for market. And the media talks about it. Oh, there's a forest that is up for market, but nobody knows where this forest is. I mean, only those who live very close to it know what forest we're talking about. So you start at a very wrong starting point. You lose the whole population, and yet we expect the masses to be able to fight this. It's not going to be possible. So we need to get information reaching people in a way that they understand, that they're able to have that sort of relational capital to the subject that is being talked about, that they can relate to it and they can advocate against it. And then the other part of what we've experienced in the past, which were very useful, was cost-benefit analysis. For any argument that was presented, when Ghana wanted to set up a coal-fired power plant, the Chinese government was investing into this. They had a very clear plan on how they're going to do this, which was up and running. What we did was to take that same amount of money and work with renewable energy firms for them to calculate if that same amount of energy was given to the solar sector, would it be able to produce equal amount of energy as the coal industry will be able to make? And what will be the health costs, right? What will be the hidden costs that might not be measured already in the calculation of a coal-fired power plant? But being able to offer that cost-benefit analysis provide an opportunity for people to have a broader view of the topic and be able to choose whether they want to go for it or they want to go against it. So this would be my recommendation on how we fight sort of this corruption and crime involved in biodiversity conservation. And the forestry sector is one of the sectors that really is the most difficult to fight in this era. And access to information, media, and making information easily accessible, but also easy to understand and build a relation to the subject that is being talked about become very, very important.
Great, thank you very much. First question I want to start with from the audience is about any good practices or good examples. So this question is to the panel. Angelique, I understand that you need to leave, so thank you very much for joining. I hope to see you soon. So for the rest, Joshua, Niranjali, Salim, and Dana, do you know? Can you think of any good examples, like good practices, things donors may have done, or any particular examples of governance or projects from the past 10, 15 years? Would you think are good examples? Like just before we were talking about shaping new solutions and taking them to scale. Like, what do you think from the past 10, 15 years would deserve replication, or what should we be doing more of that is already existing? Does anybody want to reflect on this?
I will quickly jump in.
Go ahead.
I think that we need to create a wave. It's something that Angelique said, and because she's not here, I'm just going to elaborate on that a little bit. We need to allow financial flow to be built around trust than just processes. money can flow through process, but this is how mismanagement occurs. This is how they end in the wrong places. We should be able to build trust and go beyond a lengthy proposal with so many revisions, which in the end might not even reflect the reality of what the organization even wants to do. They are only going through that process because that's what they got to go through to get the money. So for me,
sorry, Joshua, to interrupt, but does anyone know like a good example
yes,
of trustful funding?
Yes, so what there's a funding that we've been working with from Green Africa Youth Organizations called the Urban Movement Incubator Fund. And what the fund is fundamentally doing is that you take some time to build trust and to understand the problem. And fundamentally, if it is agreed that this is a problem that needs to be solved and this solution is applicable, you fund it, you go. If the organization don't have capacity to manage because they are locally led, because they are not well structured, you give them capacity. But you do not say that, oh, because they don't have it, we're going to give it to someone else and someone is going to fly in to do it. You trust them, you fill the gaps of the capacities they don't have so that they're able to have it and they're able to implement. And for me, that is the future of philanthropy, that you are able to trust, focus it on trust rather than just a process, and work to bridge the gaps that exist so that you can actually work with those that you really want to work with and those who you should be working with. And for me, that is a very good example that we have with the Urban Movement Incubator Fund.
Clear, thank you. Salim.
So let me share an example from my country, Bangladesh, where we have what is now the world's biggest NGO. It's called BRAC. It's the biggest NGO in Bangladesh, and it's also the biggest NGO in the world for the last few years. It operates in about 20 least developed countries in Asia and Africa. And I've been advising them on their climate change program. And they have designed what they call a climate bridge fund, where they received 10 million euros from the German government, from KfW, the German Development Bank, but they didn't use that money to spend it. They put it into a trust fund, which is an interest-bearing account, where they are now using the interest from that 10 million to provide small grants to climate migrants in 6 towns in coastal Bangladesh. So climate migrants who are forced out of their villages are moving into these towns. The grant that the Climate Bridge Fund provides support these communities, local CBOs, local community-based organizations, and support them to adapt to the impacts of climate change and to settle into these towns where they are moving into, and to also help the local host population as well. So it covers both the host population as well as the incoming migrant population. And the advantage of BRAC is that it has the fiduciary capacity to deal with hundreds of millions of dollars they get regularly from donors like FCDO and Bill Gates. But they can disperse it in very small amounts, in $1,000 amounts, and provide technical assistance and monitoring as well. And that is really quite rare and a good example. Also, it's a sustainable fund. We're not spending down the money. The 10 million stays in the bank and it continues to generate interest over time. Thank you.
Great. That's a great story. I didn't know about that. I didn't know that this existed. Dana, moving on to you.
Sure. Yeah, if we have time, I'll try to make it short so we can get other questions. But I would just reference again the database that I mentioned that we have on different cases of climate corruption. Right now, they are mainly focused on corruption and climate, but we do have stories that are being integrated into that database about best practices of how corruption has been mitigated, such as an example in Cameroon regarding monitoring projects. There's also different examples about the success of participatory decision-making of local communities. So I would encourage people to have a look at that if they're interested, but I would maybe highlight a little bit more a project that we're working on with the Green Climate Fund's Integrity Unit and the German Development Agency, which works together with different direct access entities or those who are applying for accreditation. It's a small group of different direct access entities from Nepal to Peru to Vietnam, which comes together regularly to discuss the different issues that arise when seeking accreditation or putting together proposals, or what comes up when implementing these climate projects from the Green Climate Fund in relation to integrity and corruption issues. And it really creates a small incubated space where tough discussions can happen and be discussed. And also just general questions to understand the language. Oftentimes the language that's used in these funding mechanisms, even as a native English speaker, you can't understand it. It's a completely separate language. And so it's about cultivating these discussions to be on the same page, and also to build trust amongst each other, and kind of a peer learning resource, and also build trust with the Green Climate Fund, because they are an active participant and they do share many best practices. So it's been quite successful so far, and we're looking to expand into further countries to continue these sharing experiences and integrity, and how it can be best implemented in climate projects.
Thank you, Dana. Niranjali, I promised I would come back to you on philanthropy. So here's your moment.
Here's my moment. And, you know, I can actually reflect on this from the standpoint of a project that that our office has been involved in. And this was specifically to support women farmers in Tanzania and Nigeria. And I sort of, my exposure to this was at the 9-year point. So a lot had already been done at this point. So I sort of got to see the results. But the lessons from that project, basically the push was to get the government to invest more in public agriculture. There was such a big focus on industrial ag, and farmers in the area wanted more investment in their communities. And most of the farmers were women. And the bulk of that project, I'd say the first 3 to 4 years, was focused on capacity building, on connecting local women farmers with decision makers. And over time, what happened was that the trust was built, right? The trust that Josh was talking about, right? It took a little time, first for communities to organize, then to meet with decision makers who actually controlled the budgets, and then to say, look, credit lines aren't going to work for us right this minute because we don't have bank accounts, right? We don't have means of showing that we can hold credit. Start with cash transfer, start with seed banks, and then we can build to other things. And I mean, it was so powerful because by the 9-year point, there were women farmers that had basically, they had organized their own networks. They could go to regional meetings and talk to decision makers about what they needed. They had identified solutions locally. They could read budgets, right? After 9 years, they could read their own budget, read national budgets, and make the demands themselves. And also they spontaneously started networks in other parts of the country that we didn't even have local programs in. And that's how you scale, right? These things, they can grow and they can scale if you invest in the right places. And to me, that was just such a powerful example of how, if you start with if you begin with the starting point that we need to shift power and we need to get people who are affected involved in decision making, there's a much better durable solution or set of solutions that you can build. So that, for me, that's one of the examples that I've seen, because I came in at the tail end, so you could see over a 10-year time horizon how that grew. Specifically on philanthropy, there are just a couple of things that I did want to say on top of the sustained funding piece, and that is when philanthropy, you know, every few years get into strategy conversations and revise strategies. Just one of the most powerful things for us is the funder who will stay, right? And not just shift to the next shiny thing that everybody cares about, right? And if they are going to move to new things, it's building off of the investments that they've already made with communities. So if there is a new thing, it's building from that point, and that's where projects are naturally evolving to. And that can make a massive difference for people on the ground, because otherwise they've had 5 years and suddenly there's nothing. And then they have to go look for other funds. Simplifying procedures. We so many forms. I mean, sometimes it's like comparable to some of the climate funds, right? What funders will ask for in terms of all of the forms and the results matrix and log frames. So wherever those can be simplified, especially trying to reach local communities, that will make a huge difference. And the other piece is it's what I think in philanthropy is called true cost accounting, that it actually does cost like it takes cost to actually run these things on an administrative standpoint, and eventually you can transition. But even for local groups, there is an administrative burden that has to be funded, right? And because we want to make things so efficient, there's often a cap on how much you can charge for those costs. And it creates lots of problems for local and national groups in developing countries, because they can't adequately account for how much it costs to actually run things and keep the infrastructure going if you want to build that kind of capacity. So that's something that I try to keep repeating to philanthropy is if can we be a bit more flexible on that, because that's what we hear from our local and national partners constantly. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you, Niranjali. Salim, I understand you need to drop off soon. There was a question from someone in the audience about the name of the fund you mentioned. That was the Climate Bridge Fund, correct?
Mm-hmm.
The Climate Bridge Fund. All right, good. So thank you very much for joining. Just before we wrap up, one last question that came up is we've talked a lot about adaptation and loss and damage. There's a question from the audience about the mitigation potential in developing countries. Should that be a priority for climate finance? Does anybody want to reflect on that?
I'm happy to take a crack at it, and then I'll have to drop off if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
So I think, a good point that Niranjali made earlier on, that we are now entering, in my view, a brand new era that combines, the COVID crisis, overcoming that and moving forward. The climate change era of loss and damage from climate change is a brand new era. And the effects of the Ukraine war adding to that as well. And so business as usual is simply not fit for purpose. We're going to have to do everything differently. And if we do think about doing things differently, then we can actually package the new things into a good, sustainable green package where we do mitigation, we do adaptation, we tackle loss and damage, we tackle poverty, we tackle injustice, all in one package. The solutions are remarkably similar, but we're not doing them. We're doing them piecemeal, we're doing them bits and pieces. We really need to be thinking much, much more systemically, globally, and then nationally as well, and linking the global to the national. And that's something, philanthropies might be able to lead the thinking around that new way of working that we have to do going forward.
Excellent, Salim. Thank you very much. That's very clear. I really want to end on time, so I'm handing over now to Farhana for closing remarks. But first of all, I would like to thank our great panelists for today, Joshua, Dana, Niranjali, and Salim, and also Angelique, who already left. Thank you very much for enlightening us, for your great contributions. This has been wonderful. And thank you again for sharing your insights. Farhana, over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Hugo, and likewise extending my thanks to an amazing panel and also to an amazing audience. The depth of and richness of the resources that you shared, show us actually this idea that we co-collaborate, that we discuss, we generate together insights and strategy is really the exciting thing going forward, and doing so in the context of a very different philanthropy, a philanthropy that is based on trust, that is based on participatory decision making, that is based on the field having a say in the direction in which funding flows is important. And this ties in with a couple of big issues that I think that philanthropy is now grappling with. So some recent reports confirm that 80% of climate philanthropy is going to organizations led by men, and that 90% of it is going to organizations led by white people. And obviously, those demographics are very much not consistent with who needs to be involved and engaged in climate action, in linking up all of the different movements. And one of the nice things I think I heard today was also actions to create healthier democracies, to rid our systems of undue influence, vested interests, corruption, are part and parcel of the climate fight too. And so we maybe need to do more convenings around how to share, understand, and link these different movements going forward. Some very powerful suggestions in my head anyway about additional seminars and convenings that maybe philanthropy could support. And again, would ask you to join us in the next round. 90 minutes is never enough. We will try and make sure that you get as many of these resources as possible. And this idea of the field itself, seeing the existing richness of the work that is going on, is the idea behind the compendium. And the compendium is essentially a mapping and a landscape. It's totally imperfect, and it's going to be improved by all of the resources that you're sharing with us. So we'd love to have those of you who want to review that, to start really creating a dictionary, a first attempt at showing who is out there. It will always be incomplete. So please let us know if you're able to do that. And that's something that we'll try and make as open source as possible to, again, avoid this dynamic of funders choosing a handful of organizations, making them the darlings and ignoring all of the work that's going on. So I'm going to wrap up, I think, because I know that Hugo wants to end on time. I know that you all want to end on time. We will follow up. We've got many emails. There was I think a glitch. So actually we had over 250 people registered. So I think we may have lost some people, and we'll follow up by email and send you the resources, and hope very much that you can also tell us if there are topics that you would like us to have webinars around. Please do that. So thank you so much. Yeah, and thank you once again to our speakers, and also to the fantastic team that's kept the animation and the organization going. So cheers, and hopefully see.
Thank you very much. Great to see everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Good to
Thank you.
Thank you, Anjali. Thank you, Niranjali. Josh, Hugo, you were great. Yeah.
Thanks.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank you,
Bye-bye,
Hugo,
everyone.
for keeping us on time.
Yeah, you were an excellent moderator. It was a tough job to do. Yeah, it was very good.
Thank you. It was very much fun to do.
Oh, good. Well, we can assign you some more moderators.
Well, next time it's someone else's turn, all right? Yeah.
We'll just keep the chat going, because there are more resources being shared, which is just incredible, and we'll try and
Really?
put them in a useful format. And I'm very aware that there's so many things that are missing in the compendium, but I know also the right thing to do is to share it, and then everyone can say, I'm not in this, haven't you heard of this, what about this that's going on? And that's its purpose. So yeah, no, thank you. Okay, I'm gonna go and have a bit of a rest, but hopefully see some of you in Bonn. Wishing you all the best with your theatrical, performance, Niranjali. That's like, yeah, wow, good for you.
It's one of the things that happened with the pandemic. I was like, wow, I'm gonna find this world again.
Yeah, good for you. Good for you. Yeah,
I appreciate it.
Okay, take care. Thanks again, Hugo. We'll be in touch. Take care.
Thank you all. Bye-bye. Take care.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Leah and Isabella and Dom. Yeah, take care. Bye. Bye. Oh, yeah, Isabella, are you saving the chat?
Yeah, I'll wait for everyone to leave just so I can save it.
I'm going to leave now and just rest, because I'm actually exhausted and I can barely sort of keep my eyes open. So
I can imagine. Go have a...
Yeah. This is the same clothes I was wearing when I left the flat in Zurich. So I'm going to go and have a rest.
Living the superwoman life.
Yeah, well done. Anyway, that was, it came together really well, and it was a really good audience. It was like over 60 people. So it's never, you always get a lot of people who don't attend in the end. So, and it had a lot of foundations as well. So at least
the content was good. The quality.
Yeah, it's great. Amazing. Okay, bye-bye. See you later.
Have a good rest. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.